Today we are looking at a case from the end of the 19th century. But before I ask you to sit back and say that we are going to Scotland, I first want to introduce you to the sponsor of today's video, June's Journey. I would like to thank June's Journey for sponsoring this video. If you haven't heard of June's Journey, it's a free to download game set in the 1920s where you look for clues and objects in a series of different scenes which are beautifully crafted, and using what you found, you try and piece together who murdered June's sister. During the game, you play as June, going through all the twists and turns of the case, and you even have a mansion that you can expand as you progress in the game. If you're anything like me, you love getting to the bottom of crime cases, and June's Journey reminds me of some of the cases that I've covered on this channel, which is probably why I like it so much. I've always enjoyed playing, especially to relax after a long day, and it's so satisfying to discover new clues, see all the twists in the case, as well as watching your mansion grow. It makes me feel like I'm in the game. If you haven't already downloaded June's Journey, I'd highly recommend it. Make sure you click on the link in the description and download June's Journey for free. Now let's go to 1890s Scotland. Alfred John Monson was born in May 1860 to his father, Reverend Thomas John Monson, and his mother, Caroline Isabella Monckton, the daughter of William George Monckton Arundel, the 5th Viscount of Galway. Alfred travelled from Scotland to South Africa once he was old enough to work and got a job for a government department. It was while in South Africa that he met his wife, Agnes Maud Day. The pair had 2 children together, Philip John and Mildred Grace. After a few years of working in South Africa, Alfred decided to move back home. Despite coming from a well-off family, he himself was not good with money and lost a lot of what he earned. It wasn't through gambling, but rather poor investment choices and living above his means. It was believed that debts were part of the reason that he had decided to return to his homeland. In 1890, Alfred began working for a gentleman named Major Hambrough as a tutor for his son, named Winston Cecil Dudley Hambrough, but who was usually referred to as Cecil. Cecil was born on the 16th of May 1873 and was the eldest son of Major Dudley Albert Hambrough and his wife Marion. Like his tutor, Mr. Alfred Monson, Cecil came from a wealthy family. However, although his father's land and property on the beautiful Isle of Wight was of great value, his father was experiencing his own financial difficulties. Major Hambrough had never been very good with money, and while he was perceived to be a wealthy gentleman, the reality of his circumstances was very different. At first, Alfred and the Major got on well. The Major had asked him to educate his son so he may be able to obtain a commission into the army. However, as time passed, a rift started to form between them. The Major did his best to convince Cecil to get away from Alfred, but Cecil seemed to be happy with his tutor and his current situation. Alfred was also keen that young Cecil stay under his stewardship. His own financial issues had become so severe that by 1892 he was entirely bankrupt. However, he knew that his young pupil would inherit a very large sum of money on his 21st birthday, and Alfred believed that he too may be able to benefit from the young gentleman's good fortune. But his situation had become quite desperate. He no longer had any money of his own and was being supported by friends who were also aware of the inheritance of his pupil Cecil Dudley Hambrough. In May 1893, Cecil and Alfred rented a very elegant property named Ardlamont House. This is a Georgian mansion built in 1820 for Major General John Lamont. It is located in Argyll in Scotland and set in its own 600 acres. This was exactly the type of home Alfred saw himself living in. But unfortunately he was bankrupt, so it was not something that he'd be able to achieve. He had, however, managed to convince his student, Cecil Hambrough, to lease the estate in his name. His credit was good, as he would soon be inheriting such a large fortune. Alfred and his family moved to Ardlamont House right away. Cecil joined them later, in August 1893. They were joined by another man, who went by the name of Edward Scott. Scott claimed to be a boating engineer, who had apparently been invited to the estate by Alfred Monson to inspect a small boat that Cecil was going to purchase. He did not, however, inspect the boats. Instead, he spent his few days with the family and went on fishing and hunting trips with Cecil and Alfred. On Wednesday the 9th of August, Mr. Scott and Alfred leased a boat, so Alfred could take his pupil out night fishing. As it began to get dark, the three gentlemen made their way to the lake. Cecil and Alfred got into the boat and started to row to the middle, while for some reason Mr. Scott stayed on shore. This seemingly innocent fishing trip almost ended in tragedy when the boat started to take in water. Alfred wasn't in too much trouble. He could swim. Cecil, on the other hand, could not. Luckily, Cecil was able to grab onto a rock and wait until Mr. Scott came out to rescue him on another boat. Cecil was quite shaken by the incident, and soon after, the three men returned to the house. The following day, Thursday the 10th of August, Cecil tried to get over his ordeal by going hunting with Mr. Scott and Alfred. They left Ardlamont House at around 7 a.m, and although Cecil and Alfred were armed, Mr. Scott was not. He was apparently just going along to help the two gentlemen bring back any game that they may shoot during the course of the morning. A few hours went by until Mr. Scott and Alfred arrived back at the house. The two gentlemen did not seem to be in any particular hurry. They were greeted by the butler, who inquired as to the whereabouts of young Cecil. They then explained that Cecil had accidentally shot himself and was dead. The butler and the house staff were shocked by this news, and along with Mr. Scott and Mr. Monson, went to fetch the young man's body. They carried it back to the house and placed it in one of the rooms. They also sent for the local doctor, a gentleman named Dr. Macmillan. When the doctor arrived, Mr. Alfred Monson and Mr. Scott explained that they had gone together to a different part of the woods when they suddenly heard a shot. When they went back to look for Cecil, they found him lying on the ground. He had accidentally shot himself. The doctor observed that there was a gunshot wound in the back of the young man's head, and finding that the story presented by the two gentlemen as one that was entirely believable, he wrote out the death certificates with the cause of death as an accidental self-inflicted gunshot wound. Cecil's family were informed of this tragic accident and arranged for their son to be buried back at his childhood home on the Isle of Wight. 2 weeks later, the Procurator Fiscal was informed by a representative of the Eagle Insurance Company that prior to the fatal events of the 10th of August, Mr. Alfred Monson had taken out 2 insurance policies on Cecil's life, each to the value of £10,000. He had made his wife the sole beneficiary of both and was now trying to collect the money. In the knowledge that Mr. and Mrs. Monson may benefit from the death of the young gentleman, the Procurator Fiscal decided to look further into the incident. He spoke to Alfred, who told him that the policies were taken out, as should anything happen to Cecil, the insurance money would serve as a sort of payment for all the time he had spent tutoring him for such little reward. The Procurator Fiscal also inquired as to the whereabouts of Mr. Scott, but Mr. Monson told him that he was unaware of his whereabouts and that he had only been hired to inspect a boat that Cecil Hambrough wanted to buy. Not entirely convinced by what Mr. Monson had told him, the Procurator Fiscal decided that the events needed to be investigated further. The Procurator Fiscal continued with the investigation. Cecil's body was exhumed and a post-mortem examination was carried out. The original doctor, who had signed off the death certificate, carried out the examination with the Crown's medical officer, Dr. Henry Duncan Littlejohn, overseeing proceedings. Following this, Mr. Alfred Monson was arrested and charged with both murder and attempted murder. His trial began on the 12th of December 1893 and captured the imagination of both the press and the public. The next 10 days saw all the evidence presented being reported in all of the newspapers, so the intrigued public could read all about the events that were taking place in the court in Edinburgh. The talk amongst the people of Scotland was now all about the trial of Mr. Alfred Monson. Despite the authorities' attempts to locate Mr. Scott, he had not been found. However, it had been discovered that his real name was Mr. Edward Sweeney, although he also sometimes went by the name Mr. Ted Davis and was a bookmaker's clerk from London and a friend of the defendant. So as his friend had not been located, it was only Mr. Alfred Monson that stood in the dock, accused of the murder of young Cecil Hambrough. The prosecution believed that they had a very good case, and made use of the latest forensic evidence that was available at the time. Witnesses who testified included gun and medical experts, along with pioneers in the field of forensic experimentation. One such witness was Dr. Patrick Heron Watson, a renowned surgeon and expert on gunshot wounds, as well as Dr. Henry Littlejohn and Dr. Joseph Bell, the man whose work inspired Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to write the Sherlock Holmes stories. Another crucial expert in the case was Dr. Brown, an anatomy lecturer who put Cecil's skull back together in order to prove that the shot had come from behind and therefore could not have been self-inflicted. Ever since poor Cecil had been shot, the behaviour of both Mr. Monson and Mr. Scott had been somewhat suspicious. They had both claimed that they had found Cecil at the bottom of a small ditch before moving his body and placing him next to a wall. When the two men had made their way back to Ardlamont House, Alfred took the cartridge from Cecil's gun and told the staff what had happened. The staff had then accompanied the two gentlemen back to where Cecil had been laid. Staff members had told the investigation that a small wound was visible behind Cecil's right ear. Despite the initial claim about Cecil being originally found in the ditch, there was no blood or any impression left by the body. Instead, blood and bone fragments were found just a few feet from where Cecil lay. A cartridge was found next to the body, which had been fired by a 12-bore shotgun. This was unusual, since Cecil's preferred weapon was a 20-bore shotgun. Alfred later claimed that on that day, Cecil had insisted on taking the 12-bore gun. However, this left an even bigger question. Why was a cartridge found in Cecil's jacket pockets that was meant for a 20-bore gun, if he had in fact on the day been using a 12-bore? The gun experts at the trial argued that Cecil could not have shot himself, be it accidentally or deliberately, as the damage to his skull showed that the gun had been shot from further away. If Cecil had the gun in hand, there would have been much more damage. Another thing the prosecution used was the presence of pellet damage on the trees in front of Cecil's body. The experts explained that this was due to bullet spray that occurs from a certain distance. Dr. Joseph Bell said, "I have not been able to make out any way by which the injury could have been done, either designedly or accidentally, by Mr. Hambrough himself. I have no doubt whatever that this wound was inflicted from behind, in a direction almost horizontal." Dr. Watson told the court of his time as an army surgeon in the Crimean War, where he had extensive experience of gunshot wounds. He said, "The wound, in my opinion, must have been the result of a shot fired by the hand of another. It could not have been fired by Mr. Hambrough." Despite all the evidence, the defence had someone who was able to dispute each and every claim that had been made by the prosecution. Professor Matthew Hay, a lecturer of medical jurisprudence and renowned police surgeon. Professor Hay argued that the pellets found in the trees could have been from previous hunting trips and, in his opinion, were at least 2 months old. His own experiments had shown that you could get a similar looking injury to Cecil's when the gun had been fired from very close range. In addition, he said that the long grass in the ditch, where Cecil had supposedly been found, was enough to hide any blood that may have been caused by the shooting. His evidence countered that given by the prosecution experts, Dr. Henry Littlejohn, Dr. Patrick Watson and Dr. Joseph Bell, and was very damaging to the case presented by the prosecution, which had been led by the Solicitor General, Alexander Asher. Having heard two very opposing viewpoints, the jury didn't know what to think. Which side were they supposed to believe? The life insurance policy initially seemed to be a clear motive. Alfred Monson had been experiencing a very poor financial situation, and £20,000 would certainly have helped him out. But Cecil was under 21 years of age, so the claim was not valid, as it had been taken out without Cecil's parents' consent. This meant that the defence could now use this to argue that Alfred knew that this was the case and would not have killed Cecil just a few months before his 21st birthday. However, Alfred Monson had tried to claim the insurance money following young Cecil Hambrough's death, which only endorsed the prosecution's theory that Alfred did not know about the law. The defence countered this by claiming that Alfred had only made the claim as he thought that the fact that Cecil was still under 21 may be overlooked by the insurance company. Alfred was not only facing a murder charge, but also a charge of attempted murder. This was in reference to the boating trip taken the day before Cecil was shot. The prosecution tried to convince the jury that this was Alfred's initial murder plot, but the evidence was purely circumstantial. That being said, the event had raised some suspicion amongst those in court and had not gone unnoticed by the jurors. The owner of the boat claimed that he had sent it off in perfect condition, with no holes. When the boat was retrieved from the water, a crude plug hole was found in the floor. The defendant, Mr. Alfred Monson, claimed that this was Cecil's doing, and the defence was able to cast reasonable doubt on the attempted murder charge. The judge also told the jury that there was not enough evidence in this instance to find Alfred Monson guilty of the attempted murder of Cecil Hambrough. In fact, when the judge summed up the case, he cast doubt on many of the claims made by the prosecution. With the jury at an impasse, the result ended up being neither guilty or not guilty. Instead, Mr. Alfred Monson was found not proven. This is something unique to Scotland, and while it may be similar to not guilty, it is very different. A not proven verdict implies that the jury feel that the accused may be guilty, but they don't believe that the case was proven beyond reasonable doubt. Although now a free man, Alfred felt the verdict was unjust. He claimed that his name had not been cleared by the verdict. The newspapers of the time, however, thought that it was the right decision, and some wrote that not proven was the only verdict that the jury could have reached. Over the next few weeks, more revelations were revealed, and it was claimed that young Cecil Hambrough had been involved in an improper relationship with Mr. Alfred Monson's wife Agnes, and this may have been another reason why he wanted to do away with his pupil. In early 1894, Alfred published a pamphlet where he explained how it had come about that he started to tutor young Cecil, and gave his version of the boating incident and the tragic shooting accident. He claimed he was innocent and that he should have been found not guilty. A few months later, Mr. Edward Sweeney produced his own pamphlet. He also exonerated himself from all responsibility and claimed both the sinking of the boat and the shooting were nothing more than terrible accidents. Madame Tussauds in London erected a waxwork of Alfred Monson at the entrance to its Chamber of Horrors. It was a great likeness to him, and he was holding a gun. Alfred Monson took exception to this and sued the company. He won and was awarded 1 farthing in damages. This was the lowest amount the court was able to give, and 1 farthing was worth just 1/4 of a penny. The case, however, Monson v. Tussauds, established the principle of libel by innuendo, which has since been used to draw up defamation laws in many countries. To prove libel, there must be publication in permanent form, but this need not be in words. What happened to Alfred Monson after this is not entirely clear. He was jailed for fraud and spent 5 years in prison. During this time, he divorced his wife. It is known that he spent some time in South Africa and that his son emigrated to the United States and had a child born in Los Angeles in 1928. Some people believe that Alfred died in 1930. However, there are others who theorise that he changed his name to escape his notoriety, or travelled to America to start a new life in California. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. I would just like to say thanks to June's Journey for sponsoring this video, and in order to download the game, all you have to do is click on the link in the description. Please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.